Thank you for having me. I wanted to just talk a little bit about my PhD research, because some of what I saw in terms of policy and how it differently impacted migrants of different statuses' daily lives seemed really relevant for this lecture series. So I conducted my research for my PhD with young migrants who were first and 1.5 generation in Brussels, and they were ages 15 to 25, and they were from various different migratory statuses. So I did research with young people who were undocumented, who were in Belgium, who were EU citizens in Belgium on work visas, for example, who were unaccompanied minors, so young people in Belgium without their families, and young people in Belgium who were seeking asylum but were with their families. So I tried to get some examples of young people from who represented different migratory statuses, and I wanted to know how they created home. And I wanted to look at the structural elements that were at play, but also where young people had space for their own agency when they were creating home. So I did a lot of participant observation. I was involved in a lot of different political actions with the young people, but also a lot of arts and different welcoming events that they created to welcome newcomers. So participant observation and interviews were the main way that I did the research. So I was particularly interested in the category of young people because I had worked with adolescents and young people in the past in the US when I was working in social work. But what I found particularly interesting about this age group is, as it said here in the quote, that it's young people are of a certain age group are often seen as an indicator for how all of society is going. So there's this fear of young people in terms of their risk for criminality and creating subcultures, but at the same time, all the hopes for our future in society rest with young people. So it's quite a difficult position for them to be in a lot of ways. And then when you look at migrant young people, when we're wondering how integration might go in society, we're really focusing on young people and how young people are doing in society. And so the young people I worked with were sort of burdened with all of this on top of their individual and personal struggles as well. So defining childhood and youth is really complicated and is done differently in different disciplines and in policy versus how individual families think about childhood and youth and adulthood and the passage into adulthood. So often what we take as a gauge or the definition to go from is from the UNCRC. So basically it's everyone under the age of 18 is considered a child. And what was really important from the UNCRC in a lot of my work is this idea that we should consider the point of view of the child in decisions that are made about children's lives. And that this should be based on their maturity and their ability to make these decisions. It's not clear how young people's points of view should be included. It's not clear how we determine their level of maturity. But anyway, this is an idea that is sort of accepted and is considered crucial in a lot of policy making. So, like I said, childhood can be thought of in a lot of different ways. It's very socially dependent, so it's different in different countries and for people of different cultural backgrounds, and it can be decided. It can be based on a lot of different ways of sort of like slicing up age groups. So depending on who's doing it. So I kind of went with this idea of emerging adulthood because at the age of 18, policy-wise, your status changes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything else in your life is already also going to change at the age of 18. So I included young people above and below the age of 18. So before I said ages 15 to 25 for these various reasons. So as time goes by, particularly in sort of the West, we're kind of making childhood bigger and bigger. And we're kind of saying, okay, well, maybe there's this childhood period and then there's this transition to adulthood period, and maybe that can last even until people are 35. So it depends on different measurements as well. So aging is, of course, biological, but we sort of measure childhood more by what milestones people have achieved or not. So it used to be that 18 made a lot of sense in the Western world because that was the age by which you graduated high school. Maybe that was something that a lot of people, or secondary school was something a lot of people had in common. Or maybe it was the age when a lot of people were getting married and moving out of their family homes. So that was a way we measured it. But in other places, if that is not what people are doing at that age, then maybe it doesn't make sense to use this age to categorize all these people as children or adults. So that's something that I saw a lot in my research. So I just want to talk about two young people that I worked with to give an example of how this policy really differently impacted their daily life and their well-being in Belgium. So Abid and June both arrived in Belgium when they were minors, and they both at some point in time were asylum seekers. They were required to attend school, which is typically the case in most EU countries. You have a right to go to school essentially no matter what, whether or not you actually do or how that affects undocumented people, it varies. And Abid was in Belgium with his family, and he came from Pakistan, whereas June was from Kenya, and she arrived alone in Belgium. So neither of these young people, even though they both officially applied for asylum and they were in the country at this point legally, could take advantage of something in Belgium called the freedom of school choice. So it has a lot of caveats, but there is this right in Belgium that you can attend school anywhere you want, regardless of where you live. So, and these are, not private institutions, but public schools. So if you live in Wallonia, for example, you could attend a school in Flanders. And if you live in Flanders, you could attend a school in Wallonia. There are a lot of other things at play, but essentially this is freedom of school choice. But actually neither Abid nor June were allowed to choose where they went to school. This was chosen for them by migration authorities. And just as an interesting example, who's someone I won't talk about very much, but there was an undocumented girl that I also did research with. And she actually did get to go to school wherever she wanted because there was no migration authority overseeing her case. So she was able to choose schools freely and to move between different schools when she decided that one wasn't working for her, which was interesting. In the case of Abid, he was part of a group that, for anonymity purposes, I call the Youth Congress. And this was a group of young people who arrived in Belgium with their families when they were minors. And they felt like young people who arrived in Belgium alone, so unaccompanied minors who arrived in Belgium without their family, had essentially more rights than them. And they wanted to be treated more like young people who were unaccompanied in Belgium. So they had a platform that they worked with a group of lawyers to take to the courts to have their sort of status changed. And one of the main things that they talked about, one of the key points of their platform, was that they didn't want to be forced to change schools. So in the asylum system, it often, I say often, I don't have numbers, but from the people I talked to, they said that it often happened that young people who were in the asylum system would start school in one place and then be moved. And this could happen multiple times, and that they found this really obviously unsettling, and that it made their adjustment and integration into Belgium more difficult. What makes this even more difficult in a place like Belgium is that moving schools can mean moving language. So the language of education. So you'd have young people who maybe arrived in Belgium, like Abid, who did not speak French or Dutch, and started school in one language education system, and then was forced, for whatever reason, and for reasons that Abid and his family never understood, forced to move to another place where then he also had to start his schooling in another language. So starting all over from learning another language. So this was something that they wanted to have changed and to make it, what's the word, interdit, what's the word in English? So not allowed, basically. They wanted this to be forbidden. So that's one part of what happened to Abid. Another thing that happened when these young people reached the age of 18, if they were, before the age of 18, living somewhere with the families, they were forced to move out of this sort of collective accommodation with family and to find their own apartment and to get jobs and also potentially be finishing school at the same time. A lot of the young people that I interviewed were really unhappy with this because if they could live with their family, it meant that they could pool their money. They also preferred to live collectively, and they didn't understand why suddenly at age 18 they had to go live alone. And they found it not only less financially draining to live with their family, but also if they had come from difficult situations where they'd struggled to be together with their family, they wanted to be able to stay with their family in Belgium. Another thing that the advocacy group wanted was to have the choice to have their asylum case considered separately from that of their families. So essentially, if their family were rejected, it could mean that they could still be accepted and remain in the country, even if their family was forced to leave. And the young people in this group had a lot of different reasons for this. But the main reason usually was education, that they felt like their family had struggled a lot to bring them to another country, not only to bring them to safety in some cases, but also to bring them to a place where they felt like they would have more opportunities through education. So the young people wanted to be able to decide if they would prioritize education over family physical togetherness and stay in Belgium if their families were forced to leave. Then we have the case of June. So June was an unaccompanied minor living in a collective center with other unaccompanied minors. She was told when she moved to the center that she would be able to choose where she wanted to live and where she wanted to go to school. But in fact, she had said she was not interested at all in learning French. She didn't want to go to a French-speaking school, but in the end, her guardian, who was appointed by the state, told her that actually it was better for her to go to a French-speaking school, and that's where she ended up. This she found upsetting, but she was happy that she got to choose where she lived. So she chose to live in this particular collective accommodation center from a group of accommodation centers where where unaccompanied minors lived. So she said that at least she was happy she got to make this choice. But in terms of language and schooling, she was not happy with this sort of lack of agency and being forced to attend school in French language. She also had family in Belgium that she was not allowed to live with. So she was forced to stay in the asylum center. So she did arrive in Belgium alone, but her family was consisted of an aunt and a cousin, and eventually she hoped to move in with them, but for the time being, she was in this accommodation center. So I wanted to look at young people of these different migratory statuses because I wanted to see what people had in common beyond a national or ethnic background that we often focus on. So I'm sure you've heard about methodological nationalism. And I think looking at different migratory statuses, it ended up being a way of avoiding methodological nationalism and seeing what people had in common based around migratory status. So a lot of what I saw, and just to be clear, I didn't go into my study thinking that I was going to look at migratory status. It's just what emerged from the research on homemaking. And a lot of what young people, the way they built their social networks and a lot of what they did in terms of activism, because almost all of the young people that I worked with were doing some kind of activism or participating politically in some way. It was often based around this migratory status and these shared experiences, not even necessarily of the migratory journey, but what migratory status meant in their daily lives while they were living in Belgium now. And so I keep talking about homemaking rather than integration. So the main reason for this was to really be able to focus on emotions, which is something that I think that the concept of integration lacks a bit. Also, I think it was useful at the time to look at something that wasn't a word that was used in policy so much. That's really a word that's used in everyday language rather than in policy. And I think also it helped me look at all these different facets that made people feel well-adjusted, a sense of belonging, comfortable in a new place. And that helped me understand some of the decisions that the young people made, such as Abid deciding to potentially be separated from his family if his case was accepted in Belgium and his family's asylum case was rejected. So I will skip through this. Basically, these are the dimensions that a lot of that I compiled from a lot of different authors working on home and integration talk about. So these are sort of the things that need to be in place for a person to feel at home somewhere. And then these dimensions can be impacted by these outside forces or by one's own choices and agency. So if people need to leave a country because of a natural disaster, for example, or migratory status is a political process, the passage of time makes memories more important to homemaking, things like that. So I just wanted to, oh, I have the wrong name on one of these, but to compare Abid and June, just to show that that migratory status really, for these two, made a big difference in terms of what elements of home they had access to and what ones they didn't. So both of them, for example, like June, who was an unaccompanied minor, which is considered sort of the most vulnerable position for a child migrant to be in a way, she actually felt more of a sense of security and control than Abid did, partly because she was able to choose where she lived, and that she could go and visit her family, even though the family outside the center, and she felt like the center wasn't really full of rules all the time. She was lucky enough never to have her school moved. So once she started learning, started her education in the French-speaking system, she got to stay there. Whereas Abid had to move multiple times, was separated from his family physically, and felt that he had no sense of control over his life in those ways. So I thought that it was useful to look at home because all these different numerous things, some of them could be in place and some of them not, and you could sort of start to understand why someone with maybe a less secure migratory status might feel more at home in Belgium than someone with a more secure migratory status, for example. So most of the young people, as I said before, were involved in some kind of political action in some way. The picture on the first screen was young people at a demonstration, young people I worked with at a demonstration for the undocumented community. But this picture is from a peace march on the World Day of Peace. And the young people here were wanting to promote the idea that everyone who's on Belgian soil is Belgian, regardless of their migratory status. And sometimes the young people who came with their families, the young people in the Youth Congress, were criticized for not being loyal to their families and for wanting to make this decision to potentially stay in Belgium without their families. But for the young people, they felt like this would be a way to sort of anchor themselves in Belgium and then be able to help their families potentially. Also a way to honor their families' choice to bring them to Belgium. And in the end, the young people in this group, at least, were all given permission by the authorities to have their cases considered separately from their families. One thing I don't know is if that has somehow made it into wider policy. That I'm not sure, but at least for this group of young people, they were all allowed this choice. And the young people themselves at the time that I met them had either all been granted at least subsidiary protection in Belgium, or were waiting for the paperwork that would grant them subsidiary protection. So essentially all of these young people were allowed to stay in Belgium the way that unaccompanied minors would be allowed to stay in Belgium. Whereas it's not clear what would have happened to them if they had their cases remained linked to their families. So part of the reason that they were always involved in this activism was also to ensure that their families could also stay. So, and also young people who came after them, they wanted to, so there was also a discussion when I worked with these young people about whether or not the group would disband now that they had sort of achieved their main aims. And in the end, at one of their meetings with their lawyers, they decided to keep the group active so that they could help young people who came after them who were in a similar situation. And I think I can leave it there a little bit early, but I'll just finish by saying that for me, home was useful because it was more universal in terms of who it could be applied to. With integration, we can say the default is to think about integration in terms of migrants, which there's a lot of arguments for talking about integration in use with everyone. It can be used with everyone, but I think it is easier to apply home as a concept to everyone since it's so common in daily language. And that with home, I was able to look at structural forces, but also these effective elements. And that I think we can look at interesting aspects for people who are often overlooked in policy. So as actors in policy, I should say. So there's a lot of policy targeted at young people, but we don't often hear about how these young people themselves also have an impact on policy and changing policy and the way things work for their reception in the countries that host them. And that's it.